this issue to have.
So, good afternoon everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today to share the findings of my thesis. This isn't the title of my thesis, but it was the key motivating concern that led me to my thesis, so it's worth mentioning. So I was concerned with how, after the global economic crisis in 2009, how a form of economic practice, neoliberalism, which was in complete disarray, managed to rehabilitate its discourses as well as its material practices and maintain its hegemony over global political economy. So obviously I couldn't do that in 2 or 3 months, probably not even in a PhD. So I did narrow it down somewhat. I picked media, so I was using a theoretical framework based on cultural hegemony inspired by Gramsci. So I picked the mass media because they're key actors in today's advanced knowledge-based economies who mediate, make sense and construct the semiotic meanings we attach to extra semiotic activities. So they're key players in shaping perceptions. I also decided that Ireland would be an interesting discrete political economy. So neoliberal political economy isn't the same all over the world. It's different in different areas according to the politics of the region, culture, history and different things that influence that. So Ireland was a good case study because prior to the crisis, Ireland was the poster boy for neoliberalism in its ascendancy. By 2012 it was the poster boy for austerity, so there's very interesting things going on in Ireland and neoliberalism. So I did a critical discourse analysis, so I used 2 leading broadsheet newspapers in Ireland, the Irish Independent and the Irish Times. There's differences between how these papers are set up, which I'll touch on later. I searched for 2 frames, too big to fail or systemic importance. I argued that these are very important frames that resonate globally in relation to finance. And I got, over an 8-month period from October 2008 until July 2009, a corpus of 39 articles, which I'll go into now in a few minutes. So it was an existential crisis for the following reasons. So it wasn't the first crisis of capitalism nor of neoliberalism. David Harvey has pointed out that these crises are increasing both in frequency and in intensity. So then we had scale. The scale of the crisis was global. And then perhaps the most important, it unequivocally undermined core tenets of neoliberalism relating to economic liberalisation, market knowledge and deregulation. And of course the response was completely anti-neoliberalism, was massive government intervention and socialisation of classes. So Norman Fairclough is a preeminent scholar of discourse analysis, and he says a crisis in capitalism is always also a crisis in its discourse. So since the 1980s, neoliberalism has dominated the economic discourse. Now this is a contested area, but it has managed to have a very powerful discourse that has dominated the arena. And this has been very important in spreading neoliberalism as a practice across the globe. So we understand the word through discourse, and you need a strong discourse to convince people of anything. So we have these symbols of successful neoliberalism: financial innovation, growth, entrepreneurialism, profits, leadership, bull market, etc. But come 2009, this all flips. So you have an antipathetic discourse. So all of a sudden you have a complete opposite: financial alchemy, disaster, greedy, losses, crash, failure, incompetence. So if it's a crisis in its discourse, how is neoliberalism supposed to, or those proponents of it, how are they to convince people that we should conduct bailouts when all of a sudden you have this kind of symbolism? So on the left you have neoliberalism and success, that's all done now, and this is what people are focused on, this is what's in their heads. How do you convince them to allow with bailouts? That's a tricky question. They come up with a very good answer. So maintaining hegemony, framing a counter discourse. So the framing effect was a very useful tool in this situation. So this relates the process of culling a few elements of perceived reality and assembling an array that highlights connections among them to promote a particular interpretation. So Brzezinski's study in 1989 is a very good example of how this worked. He was doing a study on Americans, and he found that 65% of Americans were willing to increase federal spending on assistance to the needy, but only 25% were willing to help or increase spending on welfare. So there we see very carefully, or we see quite easily, how the same event is framed in 2 different ways and radically transforms how people understand it. So we have our 2 frames, too big to fail and systemic importance. So these frames need to provide 4 functions. There's 4 functions of effective frames. So if you think about problem definition, first of all, there is a problem definition inherent in these 2 frames. Banks are collapsing, we need to do something about it. Causal analysis is quite interesting here because both frames completely ignore causal analysis And why wouldn't they? Because the banks were the cause of it and not trying to save them. So they very nicely just shut that out of the way. Moral judgment is negated. It's negated through necessity. Both these frames have necessity inherent in them. So even though something might be somewhat immoral, you might like it, if it's necessary, you kind of say, okay, I don't like it, but I have to do it, it's unethical, it's immoral, but it seems to be necessary. So they're very powerful, and obviously the remedy promotion is clearly there. So this is just a graph of my theme. So we have, this is the ordering theme that permeates through the whole discourse, and kind of orders and makes sense of the articles, which I'm going to deconstruct now in a few minutes. So look at that now. So the first theme is existing financial institutions are essential to the economy. So this is all about constructing a common sense representation. So for Grancy, common sense is it's an understanding, it's being able to create an understanding that this is the way the world is, this is the way the world always was. There's no need to question that. So you see these frames are just injected into a discourse as if this is the way we always thought about financial institutions. So the government said on Sunday that taxpayers would be safeguarded and any investment would also be made on a non-discriminatory basis having regard to the systemic importance. So that was in the Independent in January 2009. So this is a counterintuitive inversion by the dominant fundamental group, which is another Gramscian concept. So these are the people who are in a position to manipulate symbols, semiotic meanings, and they're able to place their meanings in a position of prominence that will influence the masses. So again, we have the EU Commission that are saying it may be appropriate to focus asset relief measures on a limited number of banks of systemic importance. And again, at the bottom we have Mr. Cowan, our Taoiseach at the time, saying that the government is ready to assist financial institutions of systemic importance. So these are going through the whole way, through the time period in question, and you can see this common sense is just injected in there as if there was nothing unusual about these very abnormal frames. So, new crisis, new frames, hegemony and capitalist strategy, and a little nod to the clown moth. So frames are used strategically. They're used in a particular time and in a particular place for a particular reason. So these frames were not a part of any economic discourse in Ireland, at least pre-crisis. I was able to use it at the search engine I used to get my corpus to go back over at least 10 years, and the articles don't, or the frames do not show up until October 2008 is the first time we see a frame. So as I said, they're very unusual frames. They've come into this discourse where they haven't been there before, so you would imagine that the media should react on that. So you have very unusual signifiers being used there, the media should react, and yet it doesn't. So we see from the overview here of levels of acceptance, problematization of the selected time period is very limited. Now, what's also very interesting in relation to Ireland's unique political economy, and I'll cash this out in a minute, is that the ones that were problematized there only related to too big to fail. So we have two frames, but too big to fail was the only one that was problematized, and one strongly in relation to moral hazard, which we're all aware. But no articles problematized the frame of systemic importance. So I'm going to argue this is because of Ireland's unique political economy and political geography there. I'll cash that out now in a few minutes. But also, none of the articles looked for or any logical or objective grounds by which we could apply the frames in question. So Ireland's unique political geography, which frame and why? So the economy of an effective discourse must always relate to local conditions of a possibility if it's going to be effective. There's no point talking about things in one area that people don't understand that might work in another area. So you have to know your audience, you have to know who you're talking to. So too big to fail, for me, I argue, is a fixed signifier. And why it's fixed is that within the frame there's an inherent criteria by which you can judge a financial institution. It must be too big to fail. It must have a certain size in relation to the economy for this to work. Now this signifier worked very well in the United States. It actually first originated in 1984 in relation to continental Illinois, but it has been used more and more ever since. So in America, we have the biggest financial institution in the world, so once you label them too big to fail, it's very hard to argue against that. Of course they're too big to fail, they're the biggest ones in the world. So it's a fixed signifier in that it has that in it, straight away from related criteria. Systemic importance is a floating signifier because it's more vague. It's much more difficult to understand how systemically important something is within a given system. You have to understand the system. So I'm going to just use quickly a biological analogy. If you're talking about the human body, for instance, as a system, every part of it is systemically important to some extent. So your finger is systemically important to how your hand works, your arm to how the rest of your body works, and so on and so forth. Now, if it came down to a point where you had to lose either your finger or your arm, you would very quickly judge your arm to be more systemically important. But that's because we understand the mechanics of it. So let's make that equation a little bit more complex. How about if you had to judge between a lung and a kidney? So that's just a little thought experiment, kind of gruesome. You're kidnapped by some organ kind of bard. I tell you that they're going to either take your lung or your kidney and you have to decide. Now, unless you have a very good understanding of the human body, which I wouldn't to that degree, it would be a very difficult equation to work out over the long term which one is more important. Maybe if you're a smoker, you keep the lung, if you're fond of the pint, you keep the kidney. You need more information, that's the point. What I'm trying to say here is that systemic importance of the frame is very vague. You need to understand all the components of the system to be able to apply it. Now, in the case of finance, it's a very complex system, so if you just parachute in this frame which is very complex, very vague and hard to pin down, how is the lay public supposed to understand what exactly you should apply that to? So it makes it a very useful political tool, say, if you want to bail out banks which aren't too big to fail, because Anglo wasn't, and neither was Irish Nationwide, but they're politically connected banks. So then you start using this term systemic importance. Now, why this is very important, too big to fail was only used once throughout the court in relation to Irish banks, and that was the two banks which were potentially too big to fail, Bank of Ireland and AIB. Every other time that the phrase was used in relation to Irish banks by political actors and business actors, systemic importance was applied to all the banks, particularly to Anglo. So we look at that now. So size matters. So just as I said, it wasn't known which banks were too big. So in the Irish Times, in relation to the blanket guarantee of banks, it was argued that there could have been a bank fund. Funds would also likely have moved from the smaller institutions to the two larger banks, Allied Irish Bank and Bank of Ireland. Our Labour Party's Joan Burke said the big issue is the protection, sustainability and regulation of our two large banks. So there was only two banks in Ireland which were too big to fail. So that's why the government eschewed that frame, which I argue, because it would be very difficult to use too big to fail in relation to other banks, which they didn't want to save. So as we can see, a floating signifier is one which is vulnerable to being given multiple meanings in similar situations. So we see that with systemic importance as discursive contradiction. So it's simultaneously fixed within an order of discourse relating to economy and finance. So you have the order of discourse, which is the bigger container, and within that discourse then it's fixed, it's unfixed as a floating signifier, because we don't know exactly where to pin it down. It's very hard for the lay person to understand how I can apply this objectively. So contest over Anglo status shows this. So in December, the Irish Times had an article. The government said that it would consider recapitalisation on a case-by-case basis, bearing in mind the systemic importance of each institution's plea for additional capital. The stock market responded to the reference as the share price Anglo dropped, a specialist property lender. So the other three lenders reached were involved in the wider economy, outperforming the bank. In the same month, the Finance Minister Brian Linehan remained committed to underwrite capital needs of Anglo Bank on appropriate terms and ensure its long-term strength and viability as a bank of systemic importance. So here you have it. You have Anglo hasn't changed. Anglo is still the same bank in each one, but all of a sudden systemic importance can't apply to it in one article and can apply to it in the other article. So from a structuralist point of view, frames have become polysemic to the point of failure. Has two different meanings according to the same reference and in the same context. But for a post-structuralist point of view, which is the epistemology I'm applying here, this is exactly the type of social contestation over semiotic meanings which both structures and unstructured discourse, opens up space for new meanings to emerge. But the key point here is that it's a function of power to be able to fill those spaces with meanings which dominate how people understand the world around them. So, structure over agency in a corporatized media as a conclusion. So, there's three main points here I want to discuss rather briefly. So, media ownership and profit orientation, advertising as main revenue source, and reliance on information provided by business and expert actors. So, these are the kind of influences which I was looking at that seem to corral how the media portray these frames and how they deliver them. So if we look at media ownership, the Irish Independent is owned by Independent News and Media. This is a huge global corporation. It has 200 newspapers, 130 radio stations, 100 websites, Ireland, in the UK, South Africa, India, New Zealand, Australia. It's huge. It has $500 million in revenues annually, and in 2012 it had $500 million in debt. It's deeply intermeshed within a corporate system. of which the banks are at the apex. The Irish Times is slightly different. It has a trust setup so that it's not under much pressure to have advertisements or to be profitable. But all the same, it's still a company that is based upon advertising as the main source of revenue. So there is market discipline in how the Irish Times can behave. So as you can see, both companies are structured by the market and disciplined by the market in different ways. And throughout the whole corpus, there was a complete reliance on information provided by business, government and expert actors who were able to position themselves with access to the media and give this very particular description of what the banks were in relation to systemic importance. And we see why I argued that systemic importance was favoured in the Irish case was due to its unique political economy, that there was no way you could reasonably argue Anglo was too big to fail. So you see the very nature of the very geographic influence on how this argument and how these frames panned out. So that all led me to conclude that there was a failure to critique the frame of systemic importance, and there was a large-scale failure in the public interest of the media, which is supposed to open up debate. It is supposed to help us understand about events that we wouldn't necessarily understand or wouldn't be in our everyday frame of reference. That's the role of the media, to act in the public interest. Yet there's all these structural pressures and that are growing and growing and growing in the mass media as it gets bigger as a business, that are tightening down on how it frames things.
Post-structuralist thesis used the word structure very often, but that's actually another thing. We'll make time for one question before we decamp and make time for our post-up presentation. Does anybody have a question for? Yeah, really.
When I saw your list of three there, I thought, because I'm in the middle of a media discourse analysis right now myself, and I always thought that a lot of it was driven by, I haven't really looked at the literature behind media discourse analysis, and I don't know how much your concluding 3 points are based on that. But I thought readership would be quite important, the idea that you're giving the reader what they want to read, that this is what the reader expects. Maybe the reader of the Irish Times is the businessman who wants to read about the importance of the man who works for, that kind of thing.
Well, I guess who decides what the reader wants? I mean, does the reader actually decide that, or is it the producers of these cultural artifacts? Now, the combined readership of the Irish Times and the Irish Independent is pushing 1 million. So it's an extensive readership. It's not just orientated towards business people. I mean, it's a general readership, and they also have online editions. So there is a much wider readership there. And of course, these are broadsheet newspapers that are arguing that they adhere to the highest of journalistic standards and they're neutral observers and so forth. But are you really neutral if you're a huge corporation? In the case of the Irish Independent or part one, and even the Irish Times, during the boom time, it had diversified into a big property website, myown.ie. So I mean, you have all these conflicts of interest, and we have to try and figure out how much are these conflicts of interest negating journalism, negating open journalism, So that's a big concern, and it has to be addressed, particularly because the mass media is consolidating more and more. There's only a few large companies left, we say, for instance, in the United States.
Well, I think you can all join in thanking her on that.
Any question?
Or a
question over there.
Well, there was a question.
It was a comment, question.
Okay.
I was wondering, you're providing a very good critique, and I think it's very good. But I was just wondering, in a way, are we giving too much credit to the media, and do they have the critical capacity to offer this sort of, very good critique that is given systemic importance?
Well, I think they should do. Well, I don't see any reason why they shouldn't. And as I said, if you go back to the idea of the common sense nature in which these frames were reported, these were very important political frames. They have huge input, and the ramifications that have proceeded from them are massive. So I think there's some sort of incumbent onus on them to at least put them into vogue and question them and give people an ability to say, well, do I think systemic importance applies to Anglo-Irish Bank? Give us some sort of criteria. I mean, as I said, the Irish Times did mention in the December 3 times in 3 articles that Anglo was a specialist bank. Now this was before before political commentators started saying Anglo was of systemic importance. As soon as the Independent had an article saying it was of systemic importance, the Irish Times didn't mention once again after that, which I find inconceivable, that Anglo was a specialist bank, because this would have been a good argument to make against not bailing it out. And I mean, by 2031, the Irish government would have spent 40 billion on Anglo alone. 40 billion. I mean, it's a tremendous figure for an economy the size of Ireland. It's 35% of current GDP. And if you put that in perspective, that would be like the United States spending 700 billion to bail out one bank. I mean, the figures are blowing my mind, you know. And they will blow other minds for the next 20 years.
Well, didn't stop you there, but in the interest of fairness to our other post representatives, can we just quickly thank the four that
Can I just say one thing? Just because we are running that 10 minutes behind schedule, what I propose to do is I'll cut my concluding comments entirely. But just in the interest of fairness for the 3 of our students who do have poster presentations, I would love to give them a full half hour and to encourage everyone to go around and visit their posters and ask questions before they bottom them. So if we say we come back here for 3:30 rather than 3:15, if that's okay with Kristen, because I suspect would it be your issue about 3:30?
What else would you say? We're not beyond what